If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is part of a series on the lies of productivity. When I say lie, I mean a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of what we're doing and how to best approach it. But these things are pushed at us so hard, and the challenges we face are so severe and growing that it feels like we're moving further and further away from what our situation actually should be. So I call them lies. In each of these episodes, I'll state a common belief about our work or our productivity, and then talk about the facts of why it just ain't so. A common quote attributed to Mark Twain, in error, probably, is, "It's not what you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this series is an attempt to move through those misunderstandings. So once I've talked about what the common belief is, I'll talk about a more realistic mindset. And in most cases, practical steps to address the situation from that new mindset. So here we go. Let's start breaking down the lies. Today, we're going to take on a lie around hard work. And when I say a lie, I mean the notion that work has to be hard, or if you're going to be productive, you have to work hard, or that work should be hard in order to be valuable. This worries me a little bit because I simply don't think it's true, and I'll get into why here in a minute. I think work should be easy, or easier than we make it out to be, at least. At a minimum, I think we need to work through and redefine what we mean by hard, particularly within this context. I don't think hard is necessary, and I think I can clearly demonstrate that this notion of hard is not good for us. So as we think about our work, if we think, oh, it's hard, or, oh, I need to stress and strain and scowl, and anything that's not hard is not worth doing, then I'm going to think through that a little bit. Now, I don't want you to walk away from this hearing me say that you should avoid something because it feels hard. And we're going to get into more nuanced definitions of challenging things about our work. But my thesis here is that if we lump it all under hard, there's nothing you can do about hard. All you can do about hard is grit your teeth and do it anyway. And I think that a more nuanced understanding will open up to us tools that we can use to help us manage the challenging areas of work, where if we just say, well, it's hard and I've got to do it anyway, then we just do that. But there are some other things that we'll talk about, some other problems with hard. My value prop to the world is that I think we should be able to do our work in a calm, orderly fashion. I don't think we should be frazzled. I don't think we should be gritting our teeth all the time as we do our work. Some parts of it certainly need that sort of idea, and we'll dissect that a little bit as we go forward. I mentioned before, I don't think hard is necessary, and I don't think it's good for us. I don't think this notion of, well, hard work, I don't think that's helpful to us. I don't think it's encouraging. I don't think that it's a very useful word at all. A minute ago, I mentioned the value proposition. And let's talk about the value proposition if your mindset is hard. All of us have a value proposition to the world. If you're an employee, you may not think about it except at review time or when you're looking for a job. But if you're a single business person, a solopreneur, then you think about your value proposition to the world a good bit. and I mentioned what mine is. But we all have a value proposition to the world. Many of us default to our value proposition is that we're a hard worker. While we can say that, your value proposition to the world is, why would somebody want to bring you into their organization? Or why should the world reward you? Your value proposition is, here, I provide this value. Not everybody's going to take you up on accepting that value that you provide, but at least you're clear about what it is. You know how what you do produces value. Oftentimes, this is sucked out of the employee relationship because employees often are put into roles that are very disconnected from the end user of the product or the sale of the product. And it can be kind of challenging to figure out how you doing some accounting function in the office has anything to do with how the widgets get made or how the widgets get sold. And I think that since that distance is great, we have a tendency to stop thinking about it, except in special cases like reviews and going to look for a new job. That value proposition that you have to the world can be other kinds of shorthand. It can be, I'm a CPA. It can be, I'm a lawyer. But the more closely we can define that value proposition, the better off we are when we're looking for people to pay us for the work that we do. And this is especially true if you're in business for yourself, but it's also true if you're not. Defining your value proposition is critically important because it helps you sort out your ideal customer, perhaps your ideal employer. We have a general value proposition, and I alluded to this a little bit ago. If you're a lawyer, that's a pretty general value proposition to the world. You could be a lawyer for a company. You could be a lawyer in a partnership. You could be a lawyer in your private practice. You could be a lawyer for the government. There's all kinds of different nuances and details to that value proposition. And I suggest that we dig into this a little bit as workers, and we try to define what our value proposition is at some increasing level of detail. I think if we add to our value proposition, or if we rely for our value proposition on this idea of hard work, that's bad. There's a trap there that goes on. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about symptoms. But want you to know about the idea of a value proposition and how the word hard can creep in there, and that produces this challenge for us. I'll introduce the challenge. The challenge is, if your value proposition to the world is, I work hard, then that's probably not sufficient. So you wind up saying, I work harder. If you do that, then you're constantly comparing yourself and being compared to other people, your peers, as they work hard as well. If your value proposition is, I'm a hard worker, you're a hard worker relative to someone else. If that's your value proposition or a big part of your value proposition, then you've constantly got to be working harder than anybody else you can see. That's a trap. And we'll talk about why that's a trap coming up here in just a few minutes. I think that we come to this notion of hard work from at least three sources. I'll say there's a cultural norm around hard work. And you've heard it from your parents, and you've heard it from your grandparents, and you've heard it from people in books that have been successful business people. The cultural norm around hard work works both in a forward direction and in a backwards direction, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. In the backwards direction, oftentimes if you ask somebody who's successful how they got to be successful, then you'll hear the phrase hard work. I don't want to cast aspersions on the notions of diligence or dealing with frustration or grit or stick-to-itiveness. Those are all fine traits used properly. I want to bang on the word hard because it's vague, but it also carries the connotation of this teeth gritted, putting up with these kinds of ideas. But the cultural norm works backward in the sense that we've talked about. If you ask somebody, they'll tell you, well, I worked hard to get here. But it also works forward in the sense that many people, if they're not very thoughtful about what they're saying, will say, if you want to be successful, you just got to work hard. And while, again, a more nuanced definition of hard may be true, it's not sufficient to say that hard work by itself will get you anywhere. You can be the hardest hamster on the hamster wheel, and you're still not going to make any progress across the cage. And this is why I think this is one of the areas in which I think this notion is not serving us. But to say that there's cultural norms around this, and if you look at people, they will talk about hard work, and that seeps into our skulls. And so we think, well, we have to talk about hard work as well. Added to that, and not completely dissimilar, I think we have a historical notion of hard work. When I say historical, I think we track back to days when almost all labor was physical labor. When we look at everything through the lens of physical labor, then the notion of hard work makes somewhat more sense, because our work was physically challenging to us. It was challenging to our bodies and muscles oftentimes. We would work and we would get sore. We would work and our muscles would get tired. We would work and we would get hungry. All these kinds of ideas. There are many other notions that we've inherited from the days of physical labor. And I recognize that perhaps some people that listen to this podcast are still engaged to a large degree in physical labor for their jobs. So I'm talking primarily to the white collar workers here. But I think you'll find, regardless of what your profession is, this vague notion of hard work could use some refinement in your world. I'll say, and I won't get into detail here, but I'll say there are even religious notions of hard work in the human culture and in human history. The Protestant work ethic is the belief in certain Christian circles that hard workers are more spiritual people than people that don't work hard. And again, I think this is vague. It's not that it's not true. It's that hard is a bad word used to describe the kind of attitude we want to have towards our work. There's all of these norms in our culture, all these notions around hard work. There's the cultural norm, which is I'm successful because I'm a hard worker. There's the historical notion of hard work that I track back to doing physical labor, and even the religious notion. And don't hear me banging on religion, because those of you that listen to the podcast know that I'm a religious person. I just wanted to bring that up, this association between morality and hard work. And I don't love that association. We'll deal with it a little bit later on. When we think about hard work and we think about a hard worker, that gets into our self-talk. I'm a big believer in managing your self-talk. I think most of us, if our self-talk was audible, people would be shocked at the kinds of things that we say to ourselves that we would never say to another human being, much less one we cared about. But specifically in this case, using I'm a hard worker as your self-talk, or I need to work hard as your self-talk, has two associated problems. One is it's too vague to be helpful. I don't know how you measure the hardness of your work. People talk about the hardness of stone or the hardness of a diamond, and there's a specific way to measure that. But I don't know of a way to measure the hardness of your work. On the flip side, the word is also too negative to be encouraging. I think that if we say hard, then our mental reaction to that is negative. And you say, well, I'm going to face some hard work, and our minds shy away from that. And I think we'll go into more detail about this as well over the next several minutes. For this reason, I think we want to try to refine where we use the word hard. I think we want to turn it into another word. I'm not advocating substituting the word easy for the word hard, because that's just trying to fool ourselves, and we're terrible at that. But other words, and we'll get into what some of those are going forward. The bottom line here is that I'm taking aim at the legend and lore around hard work, and we're going to redefine in some ways what we mean. And when we redefine, I think we'll find the use of the word hard to be not very applicable and not very useful. So let's go through for a few minutes about things that hard should not include, ways that we can pull pieces of it out and define them more clearly for ourselves, and then use them more clearly when we think about our work. Hard does not equal lots of hours. Lots of hours is simply lots of hours. If you face a work situation where you have to work overtime, or you have to adjust your schedule so that there's more hours spent working than is typical, it's probably better just to say that. I've got a long day coming, and gear yourself up for that effectively, rather than just say it's hard. I think the same thing is true about situations that force us to think thoroughly, to really engage our mental faculties in work. That's probably better said as focus or something like that. Facing frustration. Many people will say, well, it's hard because it's frustrating. Okay, there are things that we have to do that are frustrating, but let's use the word frustrating and use it properly so that we can gear up and we can get ready to face our mental state as we deal with this piece of work that we've got to do. Hard does not equal lots of tasks. Hard does not equal busy. If we have lots of tasks and we're busy, there are ways to handle that. There are ways to measure that. There are ways to think clearly about busy. There are ways to think clearly about there's lots of individual tasks that need to be completed before I can say that this work is complete. So it does not equal lots to do. And if you need some techniques around that, that's specifically what attention compass is for. When you get busy, attention compass helps you do busy right rather than doing busy wrong. And one of those ways is, if you're busy, say you're busy. Better yet, if you've got lots of small things to do, then say I've got lots of small things to do. And that helps us gear up mentally for the kind of work that we're going to have to do. A big one is hard is not more valuable. We think if something's going to be valuable, we have to at least pretend it's going to be hard. And we think somehow our reward is related to how hard the work is. We actually know that we do our best work, at least our best knowledge work, and athletes claim this as well, that they play their sport the best when they're in this flow state. And that's a technical word that's identified by, I think, Anders Ericsson a few decades ago. So flow state is when you're in the zone, when you're feeling it. It does not feel like hard work. It feels effortless. I'm a bass player. It feels like the strings just jump underneath my fingers. It feels like every shot you take is going to go in. So that really counters the notion that if you want to do something valuable, that it better be hard. And I think back to a commercial when I was a child, and the commercial was a lady baking a box brownie kit. And she was there reading a book, and the oven timer went off and went ding, and she carefully put her book down and got up and went over to the oven and took the pan out. And then she was going to carry it out into the dining room, presumably to serve. And before she left, she threw some flour on her face. Clearly, the implication was she wanted to make it look like she'd been working hard, that this baking of brownies was a hard thing to do. But hard does not equal more valuable. More valuable is simply more valuable. And some of the most valuable work that you do might feel easy, might feel like flow state. So keep that in mind. Also, hard does not relate to the probability of failure. That's risky. So when we think of hard, if you look at a professional athlete, and in this case, we'll take a basketball player. And so the basketball player takes 3-pointers and uses at least what he or she believes to be the same motion on all the 3-pointers. Well, most really good shooters in basketball might make what, 40% of the shots that they take from three? But a missed shot was not any harder to do than a made shot, and vice versa. It's the same motion, it's the same physical activity, action, but some go in and some don't. So a lot of people will equate hard with, well, there's a high risk, a high chance of failure here. And I think clearly that's not true. Another idea that gets mashed in with hard work is this expert level work. Sometimes people will say, well, that's at the very top of my knowledge stack, and thus it's going to be hard for me to do it. Well, when experts are working, I don't think they find it hard to exercise their expertise. My example is I'm learning to play the bass and have been playing for 6 or 7 years. As my expertise has grown, then what has actually happened is that many of the things that I do with and on the bass have actually gotten easier. I've developed muscle memory. I think things like playing scales. At one point, I had to think very carefully about where I would put my fingers in order to play scales properly. Now, after some practice, it's not, I have to put this finger here and this finger here and that finger there. It's, I need to play a scale. Okay, do, and I'm finished. Experts will chunk things, and the muscle memory kicks in and helps us do it more automatically. In fact, with the bass, some things are so well ingrained that I actually do them more often than I probably should. There's a cute little move going from one note to another where there's a particular way you move your hand, and it makes what I think is a very pleasant sound. And now anytime I'm presented with that arrangement of notes, I will likely include that. And I need to not use it every time I do it because my playing needs to have some variety and some differences in it from time to time. But it's so easy that I default to it. So this notion that, well, I'm doing expert level work, so it's hard work, I really don't think applies. And we're talking about the bass and basketball players, and you're thinking, well, Larry, I don't play the bass or basketball. I use spreadsheets. The same thinking applies. There are certainly things that I can do with a spreadsheet that I don't have to work hard at either thinking up how to do it, or certainly the typing is not hard. There are certain things in spreadsheet world, just as an example, that are akin to muscle memory in the physical world. I think that it's important that we redefine with more precision what we're actually saying instead of lumping it all into the hard bucket. And there's some things that I think we've taken out of the notion of hard work. And I'll recap what they are. Working overtime. Say you're working overtime. Say I've got to work 10 or 11 hours today. Don't say, well, I've got to work hard today, because you can measure the hours and then you can manage that in certain ways. Hard is very difficult to manage because it's very difficult to measure. If you have lots of things to do, say, I've got lots of things to do, that's manageable. The whole attention compass tool set is set up around this notion that we all have lots of things to do. And that's also measurable. More valuable is not harder. Often the most valuable work we do actually feels easy to us. It feels like flow state to us. Probability of failure, not hard. Oh, this is risky, or I usually only hit this shot 40% of the time. Let's measure that, rather than just saying, oh, this is a hard shot. Say, this is a low probability shot. And then we get into the mindset of, well, do I want to be taking low probability shots, or do I want to take higher probability shots? And we also say, okay, what makes this a low probability shot? And is there something I can do about that? So that's a lot about just really taking some of the vagueness away by not using the word hard when we try to describe our work, but use the actual word that makes the most sense. I argue that hard work is a mindset that's brought onto us through our culture, and we talked about that. We lump a lot of things into the term hard that don't need to be lumped in there. If this mindset is present in your world, then I suggest you'll probably see one or more symptoms of how you go about your work and maybe what your mindset is in some specific areas, because you've got this notion of hard work stuck in your head. Before, I talked about the value proposition. And if your value proposition includes, I'm a hard worker, either explicitly or implicitly in your own head, or however that works out, then there's a trap. And I mentioned this earlier. The trap is, if you're a hard worker and you want to get more value, you want to produce more value in the world, your only real option is to be a harder worker. Your only real option is to take that hard, whatever that is, and increase it. We really don't want to be put in that position, because that's always a comparison to other people. And it's hard to define what we mean by a hard worker and a harder worker and a harderer worker. You can't give 110%. All you can give is 100%. And we don't normally want to be redlining our lives. Sometimes it has to happen. But if we get into this situation where, well, I work harder than everybody else, A, it's comparison, and B, how do you improve on that? I'm going to work harder. It just doesn't make sense. So the trap winds up in this notion of increasing hours put into whatever our value proposition is. So there's a corollary to this trap. As a business owner, and I studied this for my PhD work, in fact, it's a notion called value sharing. I do work that creates a certain amount of value in the world, and it may be variable depending on who's consuming my work, but there's a certain amount of value that's created in the world. And I make my living off of taking a share of that value. When we get into less clearly business-oriented situations, I think we may not think about this notion carefully enough. But we need to be constantly thinking about, how do we harvest a share of the value that we create in the world? Let's take an example. If you have a job, you work for a company, and you decide that you need to go get an MBA. you're probably making this decision because somehow you think it will increase your value to the world, and maybe specifically your value to your employer. Well, let's say circumstances are that you pay for it yourself and you do the work on your own time as compared to the company paying for it and giving you space to do that work. So let's say you do it on your own, nights and weekends, and you pay for it yourself. During that period of time and after you've completed your degree, you acquired more skills, and thus, if you apply those skills, you are more valuable in the world. But how do you share that increased value with your employer? Do you say, I've got an MBA, so I deserve a raise? Well, that would be an example of harvesting part of the value of your own growth. And I think we need to think carefully about this in all of our different situations. And it goes back to the trap of increasing hours. Because if all you do is increase your hours in order to get more done, that's not really a clear sign of growth. In fact, if you have to work harder than your peers to get the same amount of work done, and I realize these things are hard to measure, if you have to work more hours than your peers to get the same work done, that's the opposite of I'm good at what I do. That's the opposite of I'm better at it than other people, at least to the eye test. So that's this trap of using the word hard or being a hard worker or thinking of yourself as a hard worker, is we wind up working harder, which is typically measured in more hours, which can in fact give the reverse signal of what you're trying to show to your employer. So that's the first symptom, is you get into this trap of increasing hours over time. Another symptom of not thinking about this clearly, of using the word hard as a stand-in when we mean something else, is that we don't define our availability and response levels. I hear a lot of solo business people talk about, well, I'll work harder than everybody else to earn your business. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But what you've just sacrificed is any control over your own availability and over your own response levels. And what I mean by that is, we're going to work really hard to earn this business means, in the eye of the beholder, you're available for phone calls all the time and you'll answer the phone quickly. Maybe that's what you wanted to communicate, and maybe it's not. But that's the solo business person equivalent of this trap of increasing hours. If we define our value proposition more clearly, then we can talk about the value that we actually deliver at the normal pace that we want to sustain over the longer period of time. So one of the symptoms is we don't define what that is. We don't define our boundaries, but we're hyper responsive and we're available 24/7. If that is your value proposition, then at least you now know what it is. But that's not a value proposition that's very consistent with having any sort of, and I'll use the phrase, work-life balance in your work. So that's two symptoms. Another symptom is if we're vague about our value proposition and we fall back to the word hard to define our value, is that we're almost always forced to overproduce quality in our product. And I'm on record elsewhere as talking about the diminishing returns on effort relative to quality, and you can look that up for more detailed thinking there. But if we're a hard worker, then we have to overproduce on quality. And it's not good for us, and it's not good for our customers or our business. So if you find yourself worried about overproducing quality, if you find yourself in this perfectionist trap, you may want to think about whether hard work is a component of your value proposition to the world. We talked about hard being this vague value proposition. This is another symptom, is you have a vague value proposition. Now, hard is not the only thing that interferes with a precise value proposition, but it is a common one and a big one. And I think I've talked about that sufficiently prior to now in the episode. I think hard work leads to what I'm going to say is mediocre performance. If we think of ourselves as hard workers, then we put less emphasis on being good workers, on being skillful, on being able to learn new techniques and new ways of producing value in our work. We say, well, I'm a hard worker, so I'm just going to gut it out with these dull tools. When in fact, we need to be sharpening our tools. We need to be acquiring new tools. We need to be investing in learning how to use new tools so that we can actually increase our productivity. Covey's notion of sharpening the saw is at times you need to be chopping trees down. At other times you need to sit down and get out your grindstone and sharpen your tool. But the notion of hard, if we let it run away with us, can lead to areas of mediocre performance rather than this ideal, chasing the ideal of skill level in your own specialty. So that's 5 symptoms. A sixth is I believe that this notion of hard work really contributes to what we now call imposter syndrome. And that's because hard is not measurable. And we never know how hard we need to work. What is hard? How hard do people expect me to work? And so we begin to look around and compare ourselves to others. We begin to wonder, well, am I just not working hard enough? But you can't measure that. So thinking through how can I better define what hard means? And then that'll help you understand that you're not an imposter. And I'll have a lot more to say about this as we look at the new mindset. But I think the notion of hard worker is one of the things that leads to imposter syndrome. And the final symptom I'll talk about, and this I think is 7, if we think of hard worker, then everything we do is colored by hard. And if we think of things as hard, then we're much less likely to do them. And I've talked about this elsewhere, and I'll get into it more as we go forward in this talk. Hard work can lead to things like writer's block. Oh, it's hard to write. Okay, well, you tell your brain that you're asking it to do something hard, and your brain responds the same way an 8-year-old child would. Your brain goes, I don't want to do it if it's hard. So these are some symptoms that are, in my mind, associated with this notion of hard work. So if you see these symptoms in your life, then you might want to question whether hard work has crept into your value proposition to the world. And if so, then that's fine, but just don't leave yourself with that definition. It's too vague. The new mindset. I'm going to say some things here that may be countercultural. So if at any point you need to just push stop on this and take a breath or whatever, I'll give you some controversial thinking. The first one is I firmly believe that our work should be a joy. I think we should literally enjoy doing our work. I don't think it has to be drudgery. I don't think it has to be pain. And if we're thinking of our work in terms of being hard, then that can suck the joy out of it. And if we don't expect our work to bring us joy, then it probably won't. I believe that we're put here to manipulate the world in ways that make sense to us, to change our environment and ourselves into our picture of what we want it to be. If work is hard and work is pain and work is drudgery, then that saps the joy out of it. Very few things are as joyful and rewarding as doing something skillfully. and being able to recognize that you did it skillfully, and for other people even to say, well, you really exhibited your skills there. And that brings us joy in what we do. I'll get to another aspect of this joy in just a minute. Our new mindset, if we can bring this in, is it will help us develop greater patience with ourselves. If we say our work is hard, that means that we want to avoid it. And if we can't avoid it, then that means that we have to rush through it, and we're stressed about how long this hard thing is taking. Where if we begin to have a mindset of taking joy in our work, then we can relax into it. We can say, well, it's a pleasurable thing to do, so I'm okay spending some patience and some time making this happen. And we'll focus on that patience a little bit more when I get to the nugget. The final thing about the new mindset, and I alluded to this just a minute ago, is our work can create beauty or good in the world. You don't have to be an artist to create beauty in the world. Programmers, who are maybe the most pragmatic people you know, talk about this notion of elegant code. Elegant code, really, if you want to compare it to something, is like good poetry. Elegant code or elegant engineering is geek speak for artistry. And people are very proud of creating that beauty. All of us can create good with our work. All of us can take on tasks that we don't mind doing that other people really hate. And so we can produce good in the world. We can give value to people. We can help them. Some of our work heals people physically. Some of our work heals people mentally. Some of our work provides things in the world that would not otherwise be there. And this is this notion of through our work, we can create beauty and good in the world. I recently came across some work by Ben Hardy. The book is called The Gap and the Gain. He takes this really interesting approach to how we view ourselves and our work. So the mental image here is there's a scale, and on one end is an absolute beginner. I've never seen this stuff before. I don't know what to do with it. On the other end is this world-class expert. So all of us with any skill set are somewhere on this spectrum in the area that we're addressing in this context. And what Ben Hardy says is that our tendency is to focus on what we lack. In other words, to focus on the difference between where we are on this scale and where the world-class expert is, and to beat ourselves up because we're not where that world-class expert is. He makes the point that another way to think about it is to think about where we are versus where we started, or versus where we were a year ago. According to the title of his book, if you look at the gap, you're looking at the difference between where you are and where a world-class expert is, or where you think you should be. Where if you look between where you are and where you started, he refers to that as the gain. So the gap and the gain. And of course, he coaches us to focus on the gain. And I'll nuance that a little bit, but just think about if you are focused when you're working on, well, I'm not where I want to be, but I'm also not where I once was. And to think about while you're working, to think about, hey, I didn't have this skill a year ago. Look at this. Look what I can do now that I could not have done a year ago. Instead, his hypothesis is that most of us spend our work focusing on what we lack, focusing on the skills that we don't have. And that's not useful as we're working. It's not useful to beat ourselves up as we're working over things that we can't do or over skills that we haven't acquired yet. I said I would nuance this idea a little bit. As I'm doing that, let me set it up for you. I think that in our work, we don't practice. Now, this could be an outgrowth of the notion that if our mental picture of our work is this hard thing, then we say, well, it's hard. I'm not going to enjoy practice. Therefore, I'm not going to practice. People really look at me funny when I say, are you going home and practicing this skill set? I go, well, no, I'm going home and the last thing I'm thinking about is what I do for a living. The last thing I'm thinking about is my work. Well, imagine you're talking to a professional athlete. They say, yes, I need more practice time. I need more work, more habit building. And contrasting those two ideas is very important. Now, the challenge in the business world is that we don't take the time to practice normally. Businesses typically don't realize the value of practice, and they're certainly not willing to pay for it. Businesses believe that efficiency requires that everything be a live fire exercise. There might be a few minutes when you can practice a presentation. There might be some time when you can actually get somebody else to sit down as your audience and run through your presentation and get feedback. But those times are surprisingly rare, particularly if you contrast it to athletic pursuits. A football team probably spends 20 hours in practice for every hour they spend in live fire. It may not be 20, it may be 10. In the business world, it's not even 1-to-1. And so as we are looking at this idea of practice, then how do we get into being able to practice the skills that we use at work? Now, I say that because A, we need to have practice for what we're doing. We need to be able to work on our skill set when nobody's depending on the outcome. That's what practice is to me. If we make opportunities to practice, that's the time when we focus on the gap. Then during performance, we focus on the gain. And this is the idea of building confidence in our own skill set. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But think about this notion of the gap and the gain and its relationship to your notion that work, in order to be useful, valuable, good, whatever, needs to be hard. I'll also say when we look at the new mindset, we begin to understand at least, that hard work is not a moral imperative. Our work does not have to be hard in order for us to be good moral people. Our work has to be diligent. Our work has to suit the quality level we promised. To the degree that we can, our work needs to avoid error. Our work needs to avoid harming other people. But the moral idea of a worker really has nothing to do with working hard. And I think that's snuck in. And that's a little bit why I included the notion of religious meanings of the words hard work. Again, not banging on religion. I get it. I understand it. I participate in it. But that's how these things become part of our thought process. So hard work is not a moral imperative. And finally, I'll say for the new mindset, we recognize that our work is not physically hard, typically. It's not that we have to exert a lot of muscle power and sweat. That's typically not the case. In addition, we need to recognize that most of us are not doing brain surgery. Those of you out there in the medical profession, I love you. Thank God for you doing what you do, because you could not count on me to do that. But most of our work, if we don't complete it or don't do it perfectly, does not have a crisis at the end of it. Most of our work is, I'll use the phrase, nice to have. It's not a ticking time bomb that we have to defuse. And if we think of hard, and that's the imagery in our head, then we can get into these other stressors. But just recognize that your work is probably pretty comfortable and your work is probably not high risk in the terms of lives, fortunes, wars. Some of you it is, and I appreciate what you do, but for most of us, our work is not that. I promise you results as you change your mindset here in these ways, and we'll talk about some results. So the first result is once we recognize that the word hard is not a good value proposition, then that'll give us incentive to refine our value proposition in the world. To know that it's insufficient and actually likely harmful to think of yourself as, well, I'm a hard worker. And we've talked about reasons why that's true, but this will lead us to redefine our value proposition, refine it, consistently think about it, and how we can improve our value proposition in the world in ways other than, well, I work hard, so now I've got to work harder. So that's the first result, and I think we've covered that sufficiently previously. The second result, we can unlock a sense of craftsmanship, of expertise, if we don't confine ourselves to the vague notion of, well, I work hard. Then we can begin to explore the nuances of our work that are special to us and the ways in which we execute our work with craftsmanship, with joy, with expertise. Matthew Crawford wrote a couple of books. One of them was Shop Class as Soul Craft, where he talks about this notion of craftsmanship. Another one, and I forget the author's name, I haven't read the book, but another one I think that's in this same area is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where we talk about craftsmanship in our work. Now, Crawford, I think, draws a conclusion that I don't exactly agree with. 95% of the stuff that he works through, I think, is excellent, but he does make this one conclusion, which is craftsmanship is best expressed or can only be expressed by having a physical, in the world result of our labor. Crawford went from being a think tank guy to being a motorcycle repair guy. He then draws these parallels out of physical work in the world, and it allows you to point to what you've done and say, yes, that thing changed in these ways because I did what I do. I think that is true in some ways, but I think perhaps an overemphasis. A beautifully delivered presentation, a great talk is every bit as craftsmanlike as repairing a motorcycle or a chainsaw. I think perhaps a tighter definition is, in order to give us this sense of craftsmanship, our work needs to be visible in the world. Our work needs to be perceived by other people. And we need to be able to point to it and say, well, this is how this work produced value. And that loops back to the notion of our value proposition. So look at some of the work that you think you exhibited your highest level of craftsmanship and think about why that work was so valuable. And that'll help you with this value proposition idea. And I'll say a third result is I agree with Crawford in the following sense. If all we do is work hard, then it's easy to lose sight of craftsmanship. And I alluded to this in some of the symptoms and in previous discussion. But if it's all hard, if it's all a grind, if it's all something we'd rather not do, then it's really difficult to perceive ourselves as craftsmen. It's hard to perceive ourselves as skillful people because we're so busy working hard that it's difficult to not acknowledge that. So the results of the new mindset, the first result is that we now have tools to redefine our value proposition as we eradicate the word hard work from our value proposition, then we fill it in with other more nuanced, better words. Result two is the sense of craftsmanship, sense of expertise that can get lost if all we think about is working hard. And then I called it result three, but it's actually kind of result 2B. Craftsmanship gets obscured if we think of just hard work as being the thing that we have to do. I promised you some tools that you can utilize with this new mindset and things that can help you achieve this new mindset or reinforce this new mindset. The value proposition is tool one. So regardless of whether you buy what I'm saying here about hard work or not, if you take nothing else away, take away the fact that you should take a look at your value proposition to the world. If you're in business for yourself, you probably already know this and you're probably already working at it. Even if you're not in business for yourself, think about your value proposition to the world. Record when people say, hey, you helped me in this way. Put that down somewhere. Hang on to that, because that'll help you define this value proposition. And as we perceive of ourselves as creating value in the world, then that reinforces our notions of self-worth, and it begins to reduce this notion that, well, we just have to work hard in order to be successful. As you define this value proposition, make sure it includes some of the things that you enjoy about your work. I know that sounds weird. Some of the things that you enjoy about your work. I hope there are some, and if they're not, then you may want to consider finding new work. I'm not a chase your passion kind of guy, but I do think that there are strengths and skills that we're born with. And if we face tasks that include some of that, then we can face our tasks with joy and greater meaning. We're using the value proposition as a tool, and we're thinking about it from time to time. Tool two is practice. We talked about this. So the result of practice is you can see yourself getting better. You can see the production of results that you weren't able to produce a year ago. You can see these things happen in your life. And practice is very good for that. It's also very good for skill building. Remember, when you're doing your work, focus on the gain. I'm better than I was a year ago. When you're practicing, it may be time to focus at least some on the gap, because the gap will tell you what skills you should learn, what things you should include in your practice. So that's tool two, is to build in some time to practice your skills. Tool three, and this is an odd one for me, and I've talked about this book a good bit. The book is The Confident Mind by Nate Zinsser. It talks about techniques for building our confidence. It talks about techniques for being able to face a situation with that sense of, I've got some skills here. How that relates to the notion of hard work, if we approach our task with, oh, this is going to be hard, well, we talked about it. Is that a motivating thought? Where if we approach our task with this sense of confidence, I wouldn't substitute the word, oh, this is going to be easy. I wouldn't say that. But I would say, this is a challenge that I've faced previously, or these are the skills that I've deployed in other areas that are going to come together to help me succeed in this task. And that's the notion of this confidence. Now, I will say something. I think people take shortcuts on confidence. I think people try to build confidence through vague, general affirmations. And I think our brain recognizes that as weak confidence. And I think that's another thing about being a hard worker. And I alluded to it a little bit previously, to say, well, I'm not very skilled, but I'm going to work hard. I don't think I want to be your customer if that's your mindset. I would much rather have somebody who says, yes, I have the skills to do this. I've shown those skills in these ways, and I think I can accomplish what you're looking for. Rather than, well, I'm not very good, but I work hard. Now, nobody says that out loud, but we want to grow this specific and concrete kind of confidence rather than the vague and easily inflated sense of confidence of, well, I'm a hard worker, I'm a good guy, right? This vague stuff, because if it's more precise, then it's more useful to us. Tool 4, and this is something that has been an undercurrent of this entire conversation, is an ability to use our words more precisely, specifically and particularly in our self-talk. The voice that's going on inside your head is controllable. Use words more precisely and see if it doesn't improve your outlook on your work. And by that, you now know I mean on the things that you do to turn your environment and yourself into what you envision it to be. So 4 tools, and then we'll do an overall recap. Tool 1, use the value proposition as a tool. Use it to help you refine your self-image as a worker. Tool 2, build in some time to practice. Find some areas of your work that you enjoy and spend a little time refining those. If you don't have something to practice and you're a knowledge worker, then I can suggest typing as something that is broadly useful and something that most people can, in fact, get better at. Practice your skills. 3, grow your confidence. It's possible. Go get Dr. Zinser's book and look through it and begin to practice some of the things that he talks about, and you can grow your own confidence. And it's this specific kind of confidence of somebody who knows what their skill set is and is thus able to speak authoritatively in those areas and doesn't have to be this broad generalist imposter on everything that happens. Tool 4, at least when we're self-talking, and the value proposition will help with this, use our words more precisely. Don't worry about using words, vague words like hard. If it's going to require diligent thought, then say that. If it's going to require patience, then say that. If it's going to be potentially areas of frustration, then say that. And that way you're better prepared to deal with it. So the overall recap, today we're taking on the notion of hard work as something that is either virtuous or something that's needed for success or something that's just a part of life. I'm arguing that it's really not, nor does it need to be, nor is hard work more morally correct than work that is according to our skill set. We talked about ideas. Hard is not certain things. If we take words out of this big mushy definition, then it shrinks, and we can use these other words to help ourselves understand what we're about to face. Hard is not lots of hours. Hard is not lots of tasks. Hard is not more valuable. We talked about that specifically. Hard is not the probability of failure. We talked about shooting a basketball. Hard is not expert level work. So if we're dealing with these things, how much better would you feel if you said, this is work that's going to require my expertise versus this is work that's going to be hard? And you can see the psychological impact here. We talked about several symptoms of the wrong mindset. We talked about the trap of increasing hours and how thinking our work is hard can get us there. We talked about mediocre performance, how the notion of hard work can lead us down the trap of thinking that we don't need to work on our skills. We talked about imposter syndrome. If I'm a hard worker, then I've got to be a harder worker than everybody that I can see. And that's really difficult to measure. It's really difficult to quantify, and that can lead us into these areas of uncertainty about what we do, about what we're good at. The new mindset, begin to think of work as something that's enjoyable. Begin to think in ways that we can have greater patience with ourselves while we're working. Remember the gap and the gain. When you're working, think in terms of the gain. And when you're practicing, think in terms of the gap. And I think this will help us progress in our work lives and really find more enjoyment in our work. Think about practice. Think about doing something that you can point to that says, I'm growing my skill set. That'll help both with your attitude towards some work and with your confidence. And then we talked about results. Refining the value proposition is number one. This will enable you to refine your value proposition, and that's important. It'll enable you to have a greater sense of craftsmanship. And we talked about some tools that we can utilize, redefine that value proposition, grow your confidence. And these tools will help put you in the right mindset to be a happier, thus more productive worker. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.